a world-changing industry that kind of happened by coincidence. Welcome, me Immortalites, to another round of the book reviews. I'm your host here, Kyron, live on the 20th of August, 2025. And as you might surmise, this is the book review podcast where I declare war on all other book review channels and their unfavorable business practices. Okay, no, we're not going to be doing that today, but we did see some of that in this book here, Chip War by Chris Miller, a fight for the world's most critical technology. And now this book was published in 2022, so a recent book. You might be asking, Kyron, why are you doing that? But it's more of a historical book than anything. 350 pages in length. I'd say it took me 8 hours of reading, and it's pretty much all text apart from this little insert here, which has some what do they call it? Plates, which has some cool, handy little photos in it, which are quite enjoyable. I do enjoy when books do that. So this is a detailed history of the semiconductor industry from its origins in the, I would say like the 1945, after 1945, more 1950s, to the present day, or to the present day of 2022. So goes over important individuals and companies that were starting their rise and then, subsequent falls and then rises again for some of them, as the semiconductors, chips become a emerging technology and then almost a vital critical industry. And we see how it goes from this kind of like very small scale of just small individual people doing things to it getting to companies, big companies, serious money, and to eventually nation states really playing around and thinking about these things in terms of geopolitical terms and stuff like this. So the book itself is split into 8 parts with 52 chapters in total. And he goes over some of the, as I mentioned, important people. So Morris Chang, Andy Grove, Jack Kilby, Carver Mead, Robert Noyce, Gordon Moore, Akio Morita. These are some of the names that you will hear from this, as well as the actual chapters themselves, which are titled things like, the parts, Cold War chips, the circuitry of the American world, leadership lost, American resurgent, integrated circuits, integrated world, offshoring innovation, China's challenge, and then the chip choke. Chip choking. So let's jump into some of the themes and questions that we have arising from this. So how did the semiconductor industry come about? Why is Asia so important? Why do Americans focus on war so much? All of these questions will be answered very shortly. So I'm going to give you a brief history using the 8 parts of the book before we can analyze this history as a whole and kind of answer these thematic questions. So the actual chapters, not the chapters, there's 52 of them. I'm not going to go over every single one of them. The parts, the 8 parts that I just read out, are roughly split into the time dates that I've got mentioned here, but they are also relatively fluid as well, because he'll talk about some things that happened or a person that happened in a previous part later in the book, etc. So the first part, 1945 to 1969. This is when semiconductors become an actual thing. So it's right after World War II. Innovation is emerging for war applications as people are realizing, especially the Americans, we're dropping bombs in Vietnam and we're doing a fucking terrible job of it because we're missing 75-80% of our targets, if not more. And we see slight hints of consumer applications of what semiconductors could do. So this is really the time period where people are going like, if I have silicon and I can use a transistor to do an off-on switch instead of like these big, they called them vacuum tubes at the time, which could do the equivalent thing. If we can make it much smaller, we could, create all of these applications. And so this era was really dominated by brilliant individuals who knew physics, like the deep physics of how electrons work and silicon and the properties and what could perhaps be possible. And were relatively practical as well. They were tinkering in their houses. They were creating, semiconductors by inverting a telescope and shining light through it, stuff like this. So Shockley, Noyce, Moore, from the famous Moore's law of that semiconductors would double in the amount of double in the quantity that you could fit on the same size of a transistor or chip every 2 years, or even a little bit less than that. And Fairchild was the company that some of these people joined. So then from 1970 to 1980, American really solidifies itself as the chip manufacturer. The Soviets are faltering in the Cold War race. They're trying to use chips for their technology, but they're kind of just copying what the Americans do, and there's always this lag of 5 to 10 years, so they're really far behind. And Asia starts to emerge, so we see these monolithic companies starting to gain real revenue from offshoring in particular. So Texas Instruments is building in Taiwan, Sony gets created in Japan, and Intel is in Silicon Valley. This is the rise of Silicon Valley as well. From 1980 to 1990, strategic decisions in lithography, which is the practice, the technique of creating these silicon chips and getting transistors onto it, and it's using, very specialized equipment of shining lights through, prisms and stuff to be able to imprint on these ultra thin wafer chips, and we're getting into like transistors in the kind of nanometers section now. So probably at this stage it was still in like the hundreds, if not thousands of nanometers in scale. And in this era of the 1980 to 1990, Japan really dominates as the consumer market dwarfs the military. So before that, the military applications were very important. After that, consumer applications. So we're talking about the very basics of, Nintendo games, of handheld calculators, of Sony Walkmans and things like this. This is where the chips are really starting to gain use and where the money is coming from, and it's not purely the military as it was before. So DRAM chips, DRAM, Nikon, Morita, who was Sony's founder, these were all kind of prominent names, and we saw the demise of a company called GCA, which was very big in America, and it was on lithography and creating these chips and the technology to create them, not just the fabrication, but the techniques to make them. It fell apart. So this was really the era of Japan, and this also coincided with just a very dominant economic period for Japan as well, which played into it but wasn't the sole cause of it. After that, we get into the 1990 to 2000 period. So this is where America resurgent. USA professional managers are stepping in. They're creating product and production efficiencies by focusing on microprocessors for computers. They begin undercutting Japan with cheaper labor in Korea, for example. And this is where America's showing their military might as well with their technology with using all of these chips, and missiles and jets are kind of the king. So names like IBM, HP, which stands for Hewlett Packard, Intel, Samsung, these are all of the kind of dominant names in this era. Also coinciding with a big bust cycle in the Japan's kind of economics as a country, which allows the USA to kind of step back in. From 2000 to 2010, it's globalization and governments subsidizing semiconductor chips and lithography for economic reasons, which become highly technical and difficult. So we see the rise of TSMC in Taiwan. It was already a very big thing. I think that's Taiwanese semiconducting something company. Huawei in China, ASML in the Netherlands, which was the Dutch company that became ultra specialized in creating the machines that would then be able to be used for production in fabrication and things like this. So we really see that the chip industry is going global, and the consumer applications in particularly computers is just going gangbusters. These chips are everywhere. They're getting put in everything. They're getting put in cars. They're getting put in fridges, and everything is starting to use chips. From 2010 to 2015 is where we see fabrication becoming the relentless pursuit of the smallest transistors through EUV, which is extreme ultraviolet light. So the transistors at this stage were in the kind of hundreds of nanometers stage, and now they're talking about getting it into the like tens of nanometers. And ultimate, I think the physical barrier was somewhere like 7 nanometers. And this is really just a race to the bottom, and Asia wins this race. We see that fabrication essentially leaves the US entirely, very close to entirely, and that Asia has, 90% of the chip manufacturing, and the complexity of all of this goes just crazy. So TSMC, which I mentioned before, eats AMD, which was the American fabrication foundry plant. But with this separation of chip design and manufacturing, so at one point, these people who were manufacturing the chips in these factories, they were also choosing the design of the chips, how it would be created, and it created this weird balance where they could be competing. People would be sending in designs to them like, hey, I want a chip that's designed like this. And because they are also creating their own designs and also producing them, creates this weird tension where it's like, oh, we could just steal their designs and use it for ourselves and not have to pay them or use their business or anything like that. So this is why TSMC, which focused solely on creating the chips, the production, the fabrication, wins. But this allows the rise of fabless companies, so who would just focus solely on the actual design of chips, and in particular Nvidia with the GPUs. Apple flips Intel at this stage, where the Apple creates its own chips as well, which it uses in its electronic devices across its broad suite of applications and hardware. And this was just a really kind of chaotic period for many companies. So they're realizing like, oh shit, we have made some bad decisions. In particular, Intel, which could have provided chips to Apple back in the day, and it said, nah, we don't really think we're going to. That was a bad decision. The final 2 chapters, 7 and 8, I'm combining them, parts were from 2015 to 2022. And this is where China begins a strategic push to learn to produce advanced technology, export cheaply, and invest in R&D. So this was really the realization that chips are a geopolitical issue. They were always a kind of economical issues where governments were giving out subsidies, trying to attract talent and companies or of actual work to their countries, and we saw this with all of the Asian countries. But at this stage, it's like, oh crap, these chips are in everywhere, and for everything. So obviously war applications, drones, AI, etc., but also just for basic consumer goods, cars, phones, telephone networks, all of these sorts of things. So this was the era of COVID supply chain disruptions, the Huawei controversies, where countries much like mine, Australia, were saying, oh, we're not going to allow Huawei to operate in Australia for concerns of them dominating our network and, security concerns, things like this, as well as the Taiwan-US protection. The book starts off with a little story about a American trawler, I think it is, or what is it? The destroyer, USS Mustin, slipped into the northern end of the Taiwan Strait on August 18th, 2020, protecting their Taiwanese interests. So if you're seeing on the screen that I've got here, this isn't from the book, but it was just a handy little infographic. So if you're listening via the audio as well, check out the chapters. And it just shows, like, if you want to create a chip, this is like an Argentinian smartphone, someone's buying a smartphone in Argentina, you just see like it goes from Europe, then to America, then it goes to like Asia, then it goes to somewhere else, and then it goes back to America, then it comes back to Asia, and then it's produced here, and then it's just like this huge complex design of supply chain just to be able to produce a consumer application. So deeply interconnected and extremely difficult industry to really get your head around as a whole. So, okay, that's the history section of the book, which most of it covers, but also getting into the other questions, which is, it's called chip war, for example, and I'm going to focus on, I guess, the coincidence aspect of Asia, and why the war aspect I don't think could really be foreseen. So the US started this all off, for example. They were the ones who were had those, founders, the Moore, the Noyces, those sorts of people. Why did production go to Asia? Why was it shipped out there? Why is Asia so dominant in terms of the semiconductor industry? Because the US had it all. They invented the integrated circuit. They had the early forms of lithography. They've got the biggest consumer market in the world. And semiconductors only really need silicon, as far as I'm aware. So it's not really a resource constraint as well. It's not like Asia had particular minerals or things like that. It was just, no. Why did Asia take over? And from what I can tell from this book, I would say there was two reasons, and the US gradually lost dominance to these two, what I would say, simple factors, which is straight up economics, labor costs, and vision. So the Japanese, Singaporeans, Taiwanese, Koreans, and Chinese could just put vast amount of workers on the production lines. And as I mentioned, it's not really a resource constraint, so it's not really big on the actual resource. It was more capital labor, especially at the start, where before robots, where these chips were having to be like created or placed or use a lot of hands. And they were saying that perhaps the type of labor was a small factor in this, and that the Asian countries seem to thrive on the monotonous perfection of doing the same task over and over, and doing it so well that you get it to perfection. Maybe that was part of the reason. Also, potentially that there was already this kind of Japanese-US connection due to occupation after World War II. But I put those down as like simple quirks of history, of coincidence. From what I could tell, there was nothing stopping the Africans, the Latin Americans, the Europeans from becoming the powerhouse, from attracting the semiconductor industry. Everywhere was in turmoil after World War II. It's not like the Asian countries were more stable than any of the other continents. Asia isn't exactly close to the US in terms of logistics of shipping or anything like that. So, you would have thought Latin America would probably be a better bet in terms of that. So, logistical, language, cultural regions, there's not that much indications showing that Asia should have been the right place for it. And so I pretty much put it down to just coincidence for one factor. The other factor was the vision, and the Asians could predict the future better, I think. So Taiwan, why did it get TSMC? Why is TSMC such a, to this day, globally dominant manufacturer of semiconductors, to the point that it's now become a kind of geopolitical issue of Taiwan, of China's closeness to it, and America trying to protect its interests in sending fucking destroyers through the Taiwanese Strait and stuff? Well, it was because Taiwan's big breakthrough was just giving a guy with a grand idea a shit ton of money, and the government there saw, I believe his name was Morris Chang. He was just like, this is going to be like a huge industry. I need money to create these productions, back me up. And they believed in him and created it there, and then they just kept rolling and rolling with it. I'm reading a book by Lee Kuan Yew at the moment, who is the Prime Minister of Singapore. Very similar thing. Singapore was just a brand new country, and it had like this single visionary at the helm, who made a lot of right political decisions and economic decisions, but also was just like, hey, we need to attract industries and talent to Singapore. And he saw the opportunity in semiconductors, and like he ran with it. So, Morris, it was Morris Chang. He had this idea of creating the fabless, focusing solely on the production of the fabrication, and this would then allow these design firms to create products who didn't have to do and focus on all of the extremely difficult things in the actual fabrication and manufacturing of chips, which in the book they called a Gutenberg moment in chip making. Obviously relating this to that anyone could create pamphlets and newspapers and things like that after the Gutenberg machine got made, but not many people know how to make a machine from scratch. So very risky, but very powerful. And it wasn't just the individuals who had this vision, it was kind of whole governments. So there was these hilarious accusations from the author at some point, and I'll talk about more about him in the extra details shortly, that, or it wasn't exactly him, but other people, he was kind of relating it and then also agreeing with it, that there was these unfair business practices. The Japanese would, for example, subsidize these semiconductors so that industry, so that it wasn't even a money-making investment, but they were doing it just solely to gain as much of it as they could and put Americans out of business, for example, with the kind of vision and hope that this would then pay dividends many years later. Same thing with the Chinese. And the funny thing is just governments were just subsidizing everywhere. The Japanese just did it better. They realized and were able to throw more money at it and bring the production to Japan, or as Singapore did it, as Taiwan did it, as China did it. So, GCA, for example, a company in America which had its demise, and it was like one of the last big fabrication places in the US. It had its opportunities. It could have cozied up to the government. It could have done all the things that Sony did and Samsung did and TSMC did, but they just didn't do it well. And so this is where it's going like, okay, the visionaries in these Asian countries are what brought the industry to them. They hustled harder, they worked harder, and that is why they are now and still dominant in the semiconducting industry. So you'd later see the same accusations against China about the kind of government interference, but it was happening everywhere in the world, and there's no high and mighty government that can say, oh no, we did it or didn't do it. So let's jump on to the author, some extra details. Chris Miller is an academic specializing in economic history and international relations. He's written a couple of books in these last 10 years, mostly focusing on the USSR, apart from this one. So that's probably his speciality. And here's an American, which touches upon my last point, related to the book name and the final sections. Chip War. Why are Americans always viewing things through the aspect of war and violence and things like this? And I did notice that I enjoyed the first 3/4 of the book, and that the politics section, as we got nearer to the end, so like this is the 2015 to 2022, or even the 2010 to 2015 section, I was just getting bored. And I think it was because it was started to become more about the author's opinion and what he thought, rather than the neutral storytelling tone which was in the earlier sections of the book. And whilst I think he's a very good history and storyteller, there wasn't that much to offer. Perhaps he is good in terms of geopolitical war centered around Taiwan, for example, but I'm not interested in it. And so these sections I was just going like, why are you telling me these things, or why are you putting your own interjections in this? I'd rather just know what happened to the semiconductor industry. So this is kind of getting to the point of a very unfortunate trend I've noticed of Americans viewing these things in terms of violence and war. Whilst there was indeed competition in this book, we're talking about companies, we're talking about industries, we're talking about money. Yes, there's going to be competition. The whole book, I think, could have been framed in terms of mutual cooperation, humanity's aspiration for greater knowledge, the ingenuity of individuals. I don't necessarily see why it needed to become chip war. There is an aspect of war to this for sure. The Americans and Chinese are, eyeing up Taiwan, and there's some tensions there. I get it. But in terms of the amount of money, the ways that it has absolutely changed the world, the semiconductor industry, I think that's a small blip in terms of the grand scale of things. So on page 300, which is right in this kind of section of where we're talking about like the politics and personal observations and things like that, there was this quote here, which is the new NSC, which I believe stood for, and this was in America, I think it was like the National Security Council or something like that in America. It was one of their government bodies. The new NSC adopted a much more combative, zero-sum approach to technology policy. From the officials in the Treasury Department's investment screening unit to the managing the Pentagon supply chains for military systems, key elements of the government began focusing on semiconductors as part of their strategy for dealing with China. And I don't. This pretty much sums up a lot of, I guess, like Americans' thoughts, and I experienced this when I was in America recently, where someone made the point, we always talk about war. It's a war on poverty. It's a war on drugs. It's a war on violence. It's a war on whatever. It's always a war. Very warlike people. And so, they were super worried, for example, that China would use this new technology to implement backdoors and spy on them and things like this, which they had been themselves doing for decades. And we saw this with Edward Snowden and things, which also gets mentioned in the book, the NSA spying and stuff like that. So it's an unfortunate thing, but it's just a common thing as well, that Americans like to frame things in terms of war, which seemed unnecessary for me, but whatever. So books like this as a whole, go into the summary, remind me why the medium of a book is so valuable. To write all of this in order, to have all of this like highly detailed research, historical perspective of being able to jump from one person to the other, like the 52 chapters in total, was, I think, very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do via any other medium. Doing it via video or via audio, I just don't think really works. I think books are immensely valuable for topics like this. So the chip industry is incredibly complex. I got a tiny little nuance of it, and I didn't convey a lot of the things, which was such as individual companies' decisions on focusing on, memory chips or flash chips, or how they were, manufacturing certain types of things, and why they had to, balance between governments. There was so much complexities in here, which I didn't even touch upon, like the technological, physical aspects, the physics of how these things actually work. So, I'm glad I spent the time researching this, I guess, in a sense, because these chips are everywhere. Just in front of me, there's probably like 1,000 chips in my laptop, in the camera here, in my phone here, in the microphone here, in the other camera here, like in the devices I have to connect my mouse to the laptop. There's just so much stuff all around me that has chips, and it is so critical and so important. So glad I spent the time of it. The only qualms I had with the book were, as I mentioned, the war aspect, but nevertheless, I learnt a lot and really enjoyed this. So overall, I'm giving Chip War by Chris Miller a very solid 7.5 out of 10. Highly recommended if you want to know more about the semiconductors and chips and the history of it. Very much worth getting into. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. This is a Value for Value podcast. There's never going to be any advertisers, sponsorships, or nothing like that on here. All I ask is that if you have received some value, you give it back to me in some shape or form. Liking, subscribing, commenting obviously is easy and handy way of doing that. I want to hear your book reviews or your recommendations of books that I should read or that you want me to cover on this channel, that you think I would enjoy or not enjoy, and the reasons for. Hit us up on any of the social media platforms with any of those. Would be very, very much appreciated. And if you want to subsidize and help the podcast out monetarily with all of these chips in front of me and replacing some of them, you can also do that via some of the links below. There is the PayPal link, and then you could also send in a boostergram and support us in a modern podcasting app through Bitcoin. Doesn't use any chips, from what I can tell. It's a protocol. And you can find out how to do that on meremodels podcasts.com/support. last section here, I am live, and I did get a couple of live comments here from one, which was asking, like, does it read like a spy novel, kind of? Absolutely not. It is much drier than that. It's interesting, but it's certainly not a spy novel. Does the book overstate the US decline? I don't think so. He had some sections in here where he was talking about, the actual percentages. This point here, East Asia produces 90% of all memory chips, 75% of all processor logic chips, and 80% of all silicon wafers. So I don't think it really overstates the US decline. They had the stranglehold on this industry for, the early part of it, but they lost it, and the actual design of all of this is going elsewhere. So I don't think it overstates it. I thought it did a pretty good job. aka maybe the design aspect of it is still heavy in the USA. That could potentially be true. NVIDIA, for example, is a massive company. So is Apple, so is Intel, and they all design chips. So yes, in that aspect, but it's also, when push comes to shove, we live in the real world, and where fabrication is very, very important as well. So, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing it up. But also, a lot of the money and, the US, China's not sending its destroyers to Cuba to protect its interests, for example, in the semiconductor industry. The Americans are having to spend a lot of time and energy focusing on Asia now. So I think just by that alone, you could say, they probably lost control of an industry which was very important to them. And right at the end, it started talking about how China's really ramping up and trying to gain more of the actual production facilities within China as well. Very important. I think he had a little percentage here. China produces 15% of all chips, mostly low-tech, though with government help, China's chip industry is growing rapidly. So, interesting. Very, very interesting. I am live here. I was a little bit late today with some camera issues, so I will be fixing the camera up and getting the better one next week. What is coming up, and you could join me Wednesdays, 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and I would very much appreciate it. What is coming up? So I mentioned Lee Kuan Yew before. There's a book called Lee Kuan Yew, which is kind of his ideas and thoughts on very similar topics to this, which is, I guess, geopolitical issues. I don't really care about it. One of the reasons I'm actually reading it is to kind of have something more to discuss with my dad because he's interested in it. So it's more of a doing something for someone else sort of deal. But I am interested in Lee Kuan Yew and these kind of people who changed Singapore, for example. I'm interested in why the historical aspect of why Singapore and why Asia managed to become such a powerhouse, I guess, in terms of this industry. So I'm reading that, Rating Bad Science by Ben Goldaker, and then From Third World to First, also by Lee Kuan Yew, which is more focusing just on the Singapore aspect and how he as a leader helped run that country and turn it from a completely new, brand new place with no history and a ridiculous intermingling of cultures, conflicting cultures, and how he turned it from a third world to a first world. So that's also what is coming up. And I imagine Juan is also doing some book reviews coming up shortly as well. So that's it. I know he's reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so expect those in the near future. So that's it for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. I really do hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are in the world. And ciao for now. Karen out. Bye.